Hey everyone. I just wanted to talk about one of the most popular topics today in social media, at the very least, which is the Riyadh Comedy Festival. If you don't know what the comedy festival is, it's basically being held in Saudi Arabia, and it has a ton of comedians actually, and a bunch of them are pretty popular, and some of them have pretty outspoken views on civil rights and civil liberties, what's going on in America and across the world. And I think one of the biggest criticisms that's been levied has been really like some of these comedians have taken some big stances politically, but yet they're willing to go across the world to go perform in a country with questionable human rights records, um, but they're perfectly fine taking that bag. And I think it's just really interesting to delve into and see people's reactions, especially as everything is just so intense right now. First, I'd like to just iterate that obviously I'm not a big fan of Saudi Arabia as a country or as a government. You don't really need to look too deeply or too far to see all of their human rights abuses and their questionable track record in general. Um, I think you could even look at Shane Gillis's jokes and comments on the matter because it's pretty funny. You could see some pretty good arguments for why people would be mad at anyone going over there and taking the bag to sports wash or, I guess, comedy wash and try to normalize, what's going on there as being okay. So that being said, I do think it's interesting though that people are so willing to criticize these comedians for going over there, but then are completely silent or don't care when comedians are performing literally anywhere in the West or in the United States in particular. Now, I'm not going to get on my horse and talk about all the evil and the wrong that the United States has committed, not only just recently, but its entire history. I don't even think you need to look too far, too, to see the human rights abuses and civil rights abuses that the U.S. Has committed over the course of its entire history, but even recently. I think it's pretty hypocritical in an ironic way that people are willing to criticize Saudi Arabia, but at the same time be completely silent when comedians are perfectly fine performing in Texas and California, Florida, New York. All of our states have human rights abuses. All of our states have controversial things that happen here, but we're perfectly fine because this is America. And I think it's a little weird here that there's a little bit of like an Orientalist sort of flavor to criticizing Saudi Arabia that I don't necessarily like. And so I guess what I'm saying is I don't necessarily blame comedians who want to take the bag and then go to Saudi Arabia, perform, and do whatever. Because I don't blame them for getting paid for a gig out in Austin, Texas, or Orange County, California, for doing the same thing. In Texas, people see all the time the human rights abuses. You can't smoke weed in Texas; you'll get put in prison for I don't know how many years. You have men of faith, pastors, who are sexually assaulting their children in their church, right? You have bounty hunter laws that target women seeking abortions. In California, you have police brutality. You have homeless people in the streets. You have constant cases of abuses and corruption all across the US and in different states. And to act as if Saudi Arabia is, I don't know, unique in their own track record while being silent on anyone else trying to get the bag. I don't know. It just seems a little bit hypocritical, which I think is really funny because this whole point is people trying to point out comedians like Bill Burr for being hypocritical because he represents, this kind of wave of, anti-billionaires and focusing on the working class man and being, aware of civil rights, but at the same time willing to go to Saudi Arabia and get some money. But I'm pretty sure he performs all across the U.S. and in different states and different areas that have, the same amount of concerns, but people are okay. Um, and I understand that it's a touchy subject. I understand uh, all the hesitancy and the intensity around it. I mean, just you can look at any headlines that talks about Saudi Arabia targeting journalists and free speech, but you don't need to look very far to see that same thing happening here. And while we might not be directly murdering American journalists, our tax dollars are being sent to another country where in the Middle East, where they are very blatantly and openly, and even recording it with GoPros, murdering journalists pretty blatantly in civilian territory. So I don't really know where to go from here. I just think it's really funny that there's this kind of wave of virtue signaling, and generally speaking, it's not coming from one particular side or one part of the political spectrum. I think it's actually pretty uniformal across the board. People pretty heavily despise Saudi Arabia, and you even have comedians on both sides of the aisle who have been criticizing these comedians for going over there. But ultimately, I think it's funny because people are trying to take a really moral high ground here in criticizing other people for their morals. But at the same time, there's just a bunch of hypocrisy involved in all senses. Uh, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think this is that serious. I mean, it's just a bunch of comedians going over to the Middle East and telling some jokes. Uh, I don't think anyone's going to get hurt by this. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter to society that much. But I do think it's funny that everyone involved just wants to get their 2 cents in. They want to take the moral high ground, but they all just want to be hypocritical in the end. But honestly, who cares? Everything's so expensive. Eggs are like $1 million. We're never going to buy houses. Everything's going to burn down in like 10 years. We're all going to be fighting over like water treatment centers in like 20 years. So, if you want to go to Saudi Arabia and get the bag, if you want to go to, Fontana, California and get the bag, I don't necessarily care. Go tell those jokes. Half of the stand up comedians these days don't even tell jokes, anyways. They just go for cheers instead of, laughter. So who cares about anything, man? Just get the bag.